All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We're going to get started. It is 12 o'clock on the dot here in Denver, and we wanted to welcome everyone that's joining us from around the globe. We know we have a couple of attendees from the EU, Latin America, and globally, so it's great to have everyone here for this important conversation. It is a very snowy day here in Denver. Winter is back. So it is a good day for a fireside chat, a little bit of a change up from our usual webinar style that we would do. So today we will be touching on three important questions, but much more in a conversational style rather than in a more lecture style. So today we will be getting onto the topic of bias in the leadership pipeline, and we'll have about 20 minutes or so to touch on a couple of important topics, and then we can go to some chat. If you are having any audio issues, our host will make sure to give you some directions about how to correct that. So we've got our producer in the background, Taylor. It looks like a couple of people are having some audio issues there. So if you do have any challenges, please reach out via the chat. We will also take time at the end of our 20-minute conversation here for a discussion section and to take any questions. So we'll move in a conversational style. If you're having questions about any of the material we're discussing along the way, you are welcome to pop a note in the chat section or in the Q&A function of Zoom below. We will be asking for your feedback at the end, so please do stick around. There's a couple of additional add-ons, so please stay with us. But I dare say you will be hopefully entranced and captivated by this conversation as much as Martin and I are. So a final piece of housekeeping is that we are recording today, so we have proactively popped you on mute. If you would like to share this recording or view it again, you can check on over into our YouTube channel over the next couple of days and view it there again. All right, so let's jump into some introductions. And who I have with me by the fire / on the sofa today.
I know, I feel like I should have a cup of tea here given this weather. So a quick introduction before we dive into today's very important topic. My name is Martin Lanik. I am the founder and CEO of Insight, and my background is in industrial organizational psychology. So as we're here going through these exciting questions with Michelle, I'll be playing the role of a scientist today. Some of you might not be familiar with our company, Insight, so I'll just do a very quick introduction. What we stand for is People Insight. That's where the name comes from. And what gets us excited and gets us out of bed every morning as an organization is this firm belief in fairness. And we work with organizations around the world to help them design the best leadership selection and development programs. Our mission is to bring fairness into the hiring process and the development process and succession planning. So that is a little bit about us as an organization. We operate in 30 countries in 10 something like that languages. So it grew into a nice size since I founded this company about 12 years ago. So that's a bit about us as an organization. But I also want to introduce today's topic. We spent the past 6 months researching this topic of bias in the leadership pipeline. And we partnered, I want to recognize our research partners. So we partnered with Purdue University and George Mason University for this very important study. And that is really the topic today. We find that through our practice and our work with clients that women and minorities still face barriers in attaining leadership roles. You may have come across the recent report from McKinsey and Lean In, where they introduced this term of broken rung. And that's one of the topics that Michelle will address in just a little bit. So in today's topic, we are really focusing on the fairness in the decisions that organizations take to identify future leaders, the next generation of leaders. leaders. So we'll be looking at how they go about doing this, what tools and methods they use most commonly, and then we'll explore some of the biases in how these decisions do happen, and whether we have some legal risk or issues like that.
Mm-hmm.
So today with me, I introduced myself, and I have this lovely lady next to me. Her name is Michelle Brown, and she's our VP of Client Success. I'll let her say a couple things about her.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. It's a great pleasure to be here speaking. I'll be playing the role of the practitioner in this space, but I'm particularly passionate about this topic, in a couple of lenses. Not only because I am a woman in leadership and so think on regularly, daily about what it means to be a woman in a leadership position, but as a practitioner and someone that's worked in the field of organizational development and HR systems for the last 20 years, I'm particularly interested about how we level the playing field, not just for equality, but for better businesses, essentially. For those that know me through my work at Pinside, I work very closely with all of our clients to make sure we have a good integration of our assessment and development systems with high quality leadership development processes. But those that know me in my night job, I also teach in our MBA program at the University of Denver. And so when I'm coming at thinking about leadership and development, I'm not just thinking about gender equality, which is very important, but how do we make sure that we're building better businesses for a better society, a better economy, and a better world. So that's the position I'll be taking too.
Great. So as we are thinking about this topic, maybe we can go to the first big question that we'll be discussing today, and that is, as we look at these HR practices, specifically in the high potential identification and succession planning, right? I think of these as these are the tributaries. This is where the first decision happens of who even receives training and executive coaching, all this really nice resources, who we are actively grooming and preparing for leadership positions. And organizations over the past several decades have been building systems and processes to do this. So from your perspective as a practitioner, Michelle, why should we even examine these processes and challenge them?
I think, for me, and as I was starting to mention before, that I have a close alignment with our MBA program at the University of Denver. And so I usually think about things in terms of a broader sort of macro level impact. And some of the interesting trends when it comes to women in leadership or diversity in leadership is firstly about the business case for this. A couple of very big things and important things have been happening in the world of organizations over the last couple of years. In 2017, California passed a law that stated that all organizations that were operating out of California needed to have at least one diverse board member, one female board member on their board by the end of last year. And just last week, Goldman Sachs announced that they would not be assisting private companies to go public, again, unless they had at least one diverse member of their board present by July this year. Their threshold will rise again next year, where they will be increasing that level and saying that they will need at least two diverse board members, thinking about gender, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and what both of these groups have said from a shareholder perspective and a legal perspective, what these groups are saying is that our society and our economy and businesses ultimately do better when we have more diversity at the top. Goldman Sachs was very quick to say that in the last 4 years, companies that have IPO'd with a diverse board member just simply do better. So they're pushing this case for more women in senior level positions because it is just simply better for business. But what both groups have acknowledged in California and also Goldman Sachs last week in their comments said, the pressure is going to be, where do we find these women that are capable for these roles? There is a very thin pipeline of capable applicants for these positions, and many companies still in California will face fines this month because they simply haven't been able to fill these positions. CNN Money looked at women in top-level positions, and they found that for the S&P 500, there was only 5% of companies, that is 24 people, that would have the credentials to step into a board-level position. And when you break that out even further and go a couple of levels down in the executive suite, again, we've only got 17% of companies in the S&P 500 that had women in top executive positions behind the CEO. So at this legal and shareholder perspective, they're saying it is just better for organizations to have more diversity. And when these organizations have attempted to respond, they're finding themselves struggling, looking for women that are ready for these positions. So this really speaks to why we wanted to examine these practices. Like, how do we have more ready and capable candidates to step into these positions to take businesses further? And that was really the first reason to examine these practices. But I can say more about that. Get off my soapbox now. I think the other thing for us to really examine is then also to look at, why this pipeline of talented, diverse candidates is so thin. And Martin, I think you referenced McKinsey & Company's paper. And in partnership with Lean In, McKinsey & Company and Lean In have been examining the state of diversity in corporate America for the last 5 years, tracking the numbers and the perceptions about diversity in leadership positions. And what they've been really clear about over the last couple of years is that it is a misassumption to put our attention on these top-level positions. Even though Goldman Sachs, California, many companies are pushing on the glass ceiling, that systematic barrier that stops women getting to those top roles, what many research is saying now is that we need to be looking far further down in the leadership pipeline and looking at how do we get women and diverse candidates ready in that first step to leadership. And that's really where things are breaking down. So from a practitioner perspective, it's really about, what are the avenues, what is going into those first steps into the leadership position, or those first steps up into leadership. And why is it breaking down there? There's systems in place. This is what we need to examine. We're misdirecting our focus if we're just asking questions about selection decisions. We need to be looking at what's going in before those selection decisions make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to build on what you were saying here, that with the war for talent, organizations have been really looking inside for the past 20, 30 years. So where we got really good as a field, and I'm talking about industrial organizational psychology, we got very good at bringing fairness to the hiring process and educating managers about the bias in interviews and introducing assessments in the hiring phase. We have lacked these sort of practices on the internal identification of talent. But that's where a lot of the talent is coming from these days, because organizations are looking inside. They're trying to identify who are the high potentials, who are the people we should invest in and we should be grooming to those positions, so that when a promotion becomes available, we have a pool of people that have already been groomed and they have gone through all the key experiences. So we are increasing the chances that they will actually succeed in those roles. But interestingly enough, for me as a researcher, so when we look at some of the data, we find that organizations today are not very good at selecting the right high potentials for several reasons. The first piece of data is that we see a really high dropout rate from high potential programs today. Generally, one analysis that I did several years ago, by the time you are done with the high potential program year after, you have only about 13% of people that actually could be promoted and are very likely to succeed in the management position. The other 87%, some of them drop out before the program even finishes. Others leave the organization, usually go to a competitor. And then even from the ones that are finally promoted, the failure rate is about 60%. So 60% of new managers end up failing in their first year. So the data is telling us that as a field, we are probably not doing the best job in selecting people who really have potential for leadership and who can succeed. So that got us thinking, well, what are the practices in organizations? You know, we can look at talent review processes, 9-box rating, manager nominations, and all the different methods and systems that organizations use to identify high potentials and successors that they are actively grooming for promotion. And maybe we'll find some interesting data there.
And that was really the genesis of this paper as we were looking at the data over the last couple of years. But obviously, if this was an easy nut to crack, it would have been cracked already. So maybe we should speak about, you know, what we studied, how we studied it, and what makes this research paper a little different. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what did we actually do here to try to get at the what broke down, or what might be breaking down in high potential identification and succession?
Yes. So let's talk about the methodology behind this research study. I, again, want to highlight our research partners from Purdue University and George Mason University. So we took a kind of two-tier approach here to answer these questions, and maybe I'll start with what the questions actually were. So our first big question was, how do organizations today identify the next generation of leaders? So in this case, we were interested in the HR talent management practices. So how are these decisions made? Who makes those decisions? And what processes do they use to arrive at that decision? So that was the first big question that we asked. And then as we learn more about this process and who is actually involved in this decision, then we posed the question, well, is it possible that bias can creep into it? So is it possible that there is unconscious bias, stereotypes that people don't even know that they have, but we know that everybody has unconscious bias to some degree. So we posed the second big question: is bias coming into this, and is it possibly influencing the decision around high potentials and successors? And then ultimately, we were interested in outcomes. So does this pose an actual legal risk to organizations? So using these practices, like for instance, a 9-box or manager ratings, is it possible that these practices are resulting in adverse impact and unintentional discrimination against the protected groups? So those were our three big questions, and I'll talk more now maybe about the methodology, about how we went to answer them. So we realized that we were asking about talent management practices that were inside of organizations. So the ideal person to tell us about those practices were actually HR professionals, usually HR business partners, director, VP of HR type of roles, who were specifically in talent management in some of the large organizations, or were more of an HR generalist type of role in the smaller organizations. And we created a survey, an online survey that we distributed to them, and we asked them specifically, how do you identify high potentials today? How do you identify successors for key positions? And then we asked them to report on the distribution. So how many men and women do you have in today's high potential program that you are currently running? As you look at your succession plan, how many women are on that plan? How many men are on there? How many people of different racial groups are on these in these programs? So we surveyed then HR professionals to also look at the diversity. And then we compared it with the general diversity in the organization. That's how we were able to estimate some of the adverse impact, unintentional discrimination. So in case this was challenged in court, right, what would, how could we use some data to answer these questions, whether discrimination occurred or not? So that was the first piece. So we collected data from HR professionals around the practices and some of the composition of the high potential programs and succession plans. Then, and we collected data from about 130, so we're just shy of 130 companies. And there was a nice distribution of companies. We had some smaller businesses, some mid-size, and some large global corporations. And then when we, one of the questions, so we did the survey first, and it actually reveals that majority of companies are relying on management. It's usually mid-level senior management in one shape or form that is completing ratings of some sort, and that is what feeds into this decision of high potentials and succession plans.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer our question about bias, we had to now study the mid-level managers and senior managers to determine whether there is some unconscious bias happening. And we decided to focus on gender and race. So we selected two racial groups, white and black, and then, of course, men and women as the two gender groups. So we collected data from over 300 senior managers, mid-level managers, and we used the implicit association test that was developed at Harvard University several decades ago. And this is one of the best ways to measure unconscious bias, because, of course, nobody, if you just ask them flat out, do you have bias against women or against black people? Of course, there's a socially desirable response, and we all like to think that we don't have stereotypes and we don't have any biases. So the way that you measure bias through this approach is you measure reaction time. So you give people associations between like common female names and some qualities of leadership, right? Like this is an ambitious person or high achiever, this person is leader-like. And then you repeat the same process and you measure the speed or the strength of association between male names, John, for example, and then again, these leadership type of qualities. And that way people don't really, they cannot trick the system. Right? So they are just trying to respond to questions or to these categories as quickly as possible. And through this process, you're measuring the strength of association.
And that's really how we get at those unconscious biases,
Precisely.
the shortcuts that human brains take to save energy and effort that show up when we're making judgments or calculations or making decisions about people.
Now, the thing about unconscious bias, the common question is does this mean that we are bad people, that we're biased and that we have stereotypes? These biases may or may not show up, right? This is just the first piece of data. We know that managers are making these decisions. Now, as you'll see, we found that there is actually bias. And then the next question is this unconscious bias really reflected in the decision? So in the composition of the high potential programs, do we see more men than women?
Got it. Excellent. Okay. With that, and I'll certainly say that these details are available to you with Access Our Report, but let's speak to some of these high-level findings. I know we certainly spent many months discussing what we think we would find, what we anticipated was going to happen as a scientist. When you looked at the data, what were you most surprised or interested about when it came to answering these questions?
So there were two big surprises for me. The first one was just how much of this decision is really relying on the judgment of managers. So when we looked at the findings across 130 organizations, 90% of them were entirely basing the decision about who has leadership potential, who is a successor for a position, on the judgment of the managers. Whether it was just pure nomination from the manager, the manager would say, here, Michelle, or Bob, or whoever.
Popping
right?
a name in an envelope and saying, there is my successor.
Yes, exactly. So there was one extreme all the way to completing some sort of more sophisticated ratings, or ratings that look sophisticated on the surface, where you're breaking this decision down into maybe various categories, right? This person can learn really well, and this person has the right kind of skill set, present.
Executive presence.
Exactly, right? So breaking it down into categories and then going off of ratings. It ranged, on this spectrum from just the pure nomination all the way to, more sophisticated rating scales. But at the end of the day, 90% of the time, it was still the manager who was making these ratings and hence making the decision. So that was the biggest surprise for me, or the first biggest surprise. The second, and probably even more shocking, was the unconscious bias that we found in this group. So I will repeat the first finding again as Taylor pulls up this slide right here. But so we found that 90% of organizations are making the decision about who has leadership potential entirely based on managers. Second, most shocking finding is the amount of unconscious bias that mid-level and senior managers are showing. We found that senior mid-level managers, when making decisions about who has leadership potential, are 3 times more likely to select men than women. And when you look at racial differences, same group is twice more likely to select white men as having leadership potential than black men. And this is then feeding into the ratings. So when you think about it, if I'm the manager filling out the ratings, or if I'm just putting a name in an envelope, this unconscious bias is then very likely coloring my
nominations, my perspective, and then ultimately my decision.
Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily have to be at the point when I'm writing the name in the envelope, right? This could be the point when the employee actually starts. If the employee is a male, I'm much more likely just to assume that this person has leadership potential. I'm unconsciously giving this person more opportunities. And then I am actually grooming this person, or more likely to groom this person into leadership than somebody who I don't perceive as having leadership potential.
Interesting. So the 2 big things there for you is how much organizations really do rely on these very subjective ratings, even though there is a body of research out there that says that these subjective ratings are quite flawed, incomplete, or inaccurate. And then we also find evidence of how many people in decision-making positions possess unconscious bias towards more men and more white men in to receive the resources that readies them for leadership positions. The thing that struck me when I looked at our research was what was actually then playing out in how those decisions were playing out. And in our survey of organizations, with some very simple calculations that organizations can be doing at home or on the back of a napkin. This is not sophisticated math, but it was 2/3 of our organizations that completed, that participated in the study, were demonstrating adverse impact. That is, we're demonstrating highly skewed and significant underrepresentation of women and racial groups in those pools, in those high potential pools, and in those succession plans. This is a powerful piece of data. It's data that organizations can use to go back into their businesses to say, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't marry up. When we think about the capability and the potential and the skills that are needed for leadership, all the literature says that geography, race, gender, industry doesn't make a difference. And yet what we're seeing is that disproportionately organizations are preparing men over and above women. The ratio is this. For every woman that is being prepared to take a leadership position, either by being nominated into a high potential program or being named as a successor, every woman that is nominated and being readied for a leadership position, 2 men are being readied at the same time. And this is where we can start to see some real issues for me. And this is, for me, the point of impact. And as a practitioner and as someone that works closely with organizations who all have a desire for better business, that the organizations really need to be tackling these processes much further upstream than just at the points of selection and hire. And while I absolutely commend the work of shareholders and laws and California and Goldman Sachs and so on, this is really not enough to just be pulling top executives or pulling more diverse candidates into top positions. We have to get down to the base level, that broken rung, that first step up into management. But more importantly, how we get more people even just into the pools. And that, interestingly, if we were able to correct and hire a representative sample, or maybe even just an equal number of women into that first level position, if we just corrected that, we would potentially have 1 million more women in leadership positions in corporate America in just 5 years. So this is just small efforts that organizations can take to start to correct and challenge these processes by which they make these decisions. And this has massive impacts downstream. The end goal here is, and I'll circle back to my position on this, that the end goal here is not just equality. That's good for society, but this is actually better for business. This is the way that organizations can be really absorbing the talent they have within their organization and selecting and having the best leaders at their helm. And this is, I think, for me, one of the most important pieces that we take away.
I think absolutely. It's the fairness, and when we use the word fairness, it's, of course, there's that equality piece, but I think at the end of the day, it is putting the best people, most capable people in these leadership positions of high status, high power, where they can either do a lot of good or do a lot of damage for the employees' well-being and the society and the top bottom lines. So and although we are very passionate about diversity, it is, at the end of the day, you're absolutely right, a business question and an issue for the business.
Absolutely. That really leads us into where to from here. And I know we've just covered a couple of the top pieces of the findings. All of this information is available to all of our attendees today. We will have a full report that includes some much more detail than we've had time to cover today. Also, some deeper discussion into some of the processes and practices that we have discussed. The full paper on repairing the broken rung will be available in March, so just a few short weeks away. And for anyone that would like access to that, you are very welcome and encouraged to sign up for first access to that paper by visiting www.com.
Nobody does that.
No,
No.
You just go to the pinside.com /research, but you will find it there. We would absolutely very much encourage people to access that report. It's been a treat, I think, to be involved in some really important research and discovering some things that have yet been unanswered in this space.
Absolutely. We'll also launch a poll at the end of the webinar today, and you'll have an opportunity to sign up for the research paper there as well. So you have two options.
Great. I think we also have a couple of minutes now just for questions or discussions. And for those folks that might have some questions about the study, the findings, the implications, or even if there's just some commentary about the findings, you are very welcome to pop them in the chat. While you are formulating your questions or commentary, there is a poll that you can see up in front of you here. In just a moment, I'll talk a little bit about some of the next webinars that will be coming up, and of course your input and feedback into the webinars is absolutely appreciated and goes into how we structure and how we formulate and what we include in these webinars. So for those that would like to make sure that this is a valuable investment of your time, thank you for your input into the polls there. And we still have a couple of beats left for questions, and then I will get into speaking a little bit about the other pieces. We have a question here and about leadership programs for high potentials, and what kind of skills or capabilities do we feel are to be the focus of such programs, and what is and isn't working, and why.
I'll take a first crack.
Yeah, okay.
Especially the first part, what skills or capabilities. I think that's an excellent question. A lot of times I've seen organizations to put that put high potential programs or leadership programs based on the flavor of the day, right? So you might have some standardized courses that you about dysfunctions of a team, or how to have crucial conversations, or similar type of, and then we know generally what the organizations are, or what the employees need in terms of skill set. So that's one approach. I think much more scientific approach would be to do a needs analysis. So once you identify who your high potentials are, or who your trainees are in this leadership program, then you put them through some sort of an assessment that measures their leadership skills, and that gives you the data then to make decisions about what should you actually include in the leadership program. Our majority of them struggling with communication, or our majority of them struggling with decision making, or planning and organizing, or speaking with charisma, or any of these topics. So that's how I would answer the first part of that question. What is and what isn't working? That's a very broad question. We could probably have another 5 webinars just on this topic of what is broken with leadership development and what is working. There are a few things that I have seen work really well. So of course, solid needs analysis and getting a baseline in the beginning of the program allows you to structure the program based on the needs of your audience. But a year later, you can compare then the baseline to, if you run the assessment again a year later, you can actually compare growth. And based on that, you can tell which interventions are working and which interventions are not working. So having that measurement piece is something that works well. The other thing that I think, and I found that works well also is having some sort of a selection process, and a solid selection process into the development program. When you think of the best business schools, right, the question always in my mind has been, are these graduates really strong graduates because the business schools are so good at selecting the top people, or is it the education? My answer is it's the combination. So if you want your leadership program to be solid, you have to have a solid way how you are selecting the people who are most capable of learning and who actually want to learn. And then give them a really strong curriculum. So it's the combination of selection and development that is going to produce the strongest future leaders.
Fantastic.
Anything for you to add from your practical?
From my practical perspective, I think when you're starting to think about skills and capabilities that you feel are important for emerging leader programs or high potential programs, I think it's also important to put it in the context of your organization and to center the question about what capabilities do emerging leaders need in the context of what is happening inside our organization. So what does that mean that we're confronting in terms of our market? What does that mean in terms of what we need to confront in terms of innovation? What is it that our organization is going to be dealing with? Which challenges are we going to be confronting? And which kinds of capabilities are going to be most important for leaders to possess in the context of the organization? So having it strategically founded is also important. This is a very long question again about what could be working and not. I think sometimes we are too quick to identify future leaders based on what they're doing in their current role, rather than attempting to place them into the perspective of what they're going to be doing in their future role. And I think that there is a blog coming out on that one just in the next couple of weeks. So watch this space about this one. We have another question.
Yes, I'll read it and then you can answer. Yep. We are an organization that is just beginning to start a more formal structured equity, diversity, and inclusion initiative. Congratulations, it's a big step. Any suggestions or tips for us as we move forward? Smile.
Yes. Okay. From a practitioner perspective, I think one of the things that is always challenging for organizations in this space is really to get executive level support around the criticality and the business reasons for changing the way the organization is doing things. So the first thing that I would be really thinking about here is, how do you begin to communicate and get all stakeholders involved in a way that is very meaningful and to them. And what I mean by that is, many organizations, and like I talked about a couple of examples earlier, are making this pull, but without a good understanding of why they might be needing to correct some of these pieces, and what the actual tangible benefits will be if we can start to correct for more diversity in leadership positions. So the first part that I would start with is getting your hands on some really good quality data about what is happening inside your own organization. We talked here about calculating adverse impact for all parts of your employee life cycle, and then being able to attempt to quantify what is missing or not. This is usually a good way to get business leaders' attention to say that the processes by which we're making decisions are either potentially showing adverse impact, potentially showing evidence of discrimination. This puts you at a risk for legal action, but also starting to highlight to people where issues of bias can start to play out in the employee life cycle. There's more to be said on that in the final chapter of our report, Repairing the Broken Rung, about what businesses should start to do. But it definitely starts with getting your hands on the data, making people very aware of the size and scale of the issue, but more in favor of what could potentially happen for our talent and our competitive advantage if we start to correct for this.
Great. I think those are the questions.
We have one more if you open the Q&A section.
Oh, there's one more question.
So we have, what is the qualitative or quantitative method did you use for calculating adverse impact? Was it the 80% rule, true standard deviations, or something else?
Yeah, very good question. There are multiple different ways how adverse impact can be estimated. There's a lot of discussion about how to do this. We used the 80% rule for our analyses because that was the easiest way that we could do that with the data we had. We also used the composition of employees as a proxy for the actual selection pool, and know that this is one pretty common and accepted way to estimate adverse impact. There are others, more sophisticated statistical methods, depending on the data set you're working with and your particular situation. You might choose a different method. We use the 80% rule.
Fantastic, thank you.
I think there's another question, or it was the same one, and we just...
There we go. All right. Okay, so that really brings us to about the top of our time today. I'll just speak a little about what's coming up next. Firstly, thank you for your participation in the poll there. That really helps us get focused on providing good quality content that's both provocative but also adds information and action to your work. We will be presenting webinars each month through 2020. Fireside chats, who knows? I will see you again in March, where we'll be digging into unconscious bias and looking much more at some of the methodology that we used in the collection and measurement of unconscious bias and how it shows up in some of the processes, including the selection of high potentials, but also in other parts of the employee life cycle. And then Martin, you'll be joined by a guest where you'll start to talk a little more about increasing the diversity in the next generation of leaders. And we'll be spending a good portion of our time in the next couple of months really drilling and digging into the topics that are present in our paper here. Of course, you are also welcome to join us by signing up to our newsletter, where we will be advertising these events, as well as letting you know of other pieces of information that are coming out on these topics, blogs and so on. So we certainly would love to see you again, and you will see our webinars where you can register at them at pinsite.com/events. So I think that is all we have time for today. We very much appreciate you joining us and being as deeply passionate about putting the best leaders into the most important roles. We'll be happy to stay on the line if anyone has any more questions. Otherwise, thank you again for being here. Stay warm and safe if you're in Denver, and see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.